If one late winter afternoon you were alone in the middle of a deserted border and suddenly heard strange footsteps approaching from behind, what would you do? That was the moment Marian Hale, a woman with so much loss on her thin shoulders, was forced to face at the lonely train station on the edge of Sagebrush County. No acquaintances, no shelter, just the cold wind and the distant sound of the train. And then, 3 men appeared, calling her by her full name, as if fate had targeted her all along. In the midst of a danger that seemed to swallow her will, Marian had a choice: run away or stand and fight back, knowing that she had only 2 bare hands. Just think, if it were you in a land where no one knew your cry for help, what would you do to survive? Would you tremble, or would you fight to keep your last shred of dignity? And then, just when it seemed all was over, a tall figure stepped out of the rain and thunder. A quiet Midwestern man named Jonah Reed, who would say to her the words she had never heard before: "You will not have to fight alone anymore." But why is Marian being chased? Who is Jonah in this wild, prejudiced land? And what will they face next? Join us as we continue our story, a sad yet warm love song of courage, kindness, and the resurrection of broken hearts. If you love these Western healing stories, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. The first rain of the season was an old warning on the Wyoming frontier, the kind that didn't wet the ground but was enough to make anyone standing outside feel the chills seep into their bones. At Willow Gap, the damp earth and the smoke from the station's stoves mingled, creating the melancholy atmosphere of places where people stopped and moved on, rarely looking back. Marian Hale stood huddled under the eaves, clutching her old leather satchel, her only remaining baggage after a long and tiring journey. Thin drops of rain clung to the brim of her hat and slid down like wordless sighs. She waited for the last item to be removed from the storeroom, a wooden trunk that had belonged to her father, heavier than any of its contents were worth. A flash of lightning tore across the sky. The sudden light revealed Marian's face, eyes dark from sleepless nights, cheeks streaked with the dust of the journey and the strain of trying to keep her tired body calm. The sight was heartbreaking, especially for those who had passed half their lives and knew how heavy loneliness could be. The moment the light went out, Marian heard strange footsteps. Not hurried, but as if they had been standing there for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to come out. 3 men appeared from the shadowy corner of the warehouse. The kerosene lamplight fell on their faces, dusty, rough, and somewhat callous to both law and compassion. The tallest man stepped forward, his long, sodden coat clinging to his muscular frame. Looking at him, Marian understood trouble not only finds, but finds the right person. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice hoarse and uncouth. He used her name. Marian was stunned. She had never told anyone her name at Willow Gap, and the bus that had just arrived had her as the only stranger. Not by accident. Can't be by accident. A chill ran down her spine. But Marian did not back down. "What do you want from me?" She tried to keep her voice calm, but it was shaking a bit like a willow branch swaying in the wind. "Just wanted to chat a bit." The second guy laughed coldly, the laugh of someone used to striking fear into the weak. Before she could react, the third man rushed forward, his dirty hand roughly grabbing Marian's wrist as if he wanted to drag her into the darkness behind the warehouse. But Marian Hale today is not the same woman who endured so many years ago. Everything she has been through, the humiliation of a life of scorn, years of being marginalized. The loss of her family has taught her one thing: staying silent for too long makes others think you are vulnerable. And she decided this time it wouldn't be like that. Marian swung her arm down hard, hitting the man's wrist. He felt pain and let go for a moment. She backed away immediately, bending down to pick up a fist-sized rock at her feet. The rain made it slippery, but it was heavy enough to be a weapon in the hands of someone determined to survive. The leader smirked. "No need to make it so difficult, Marian. Barlow's men have never failed. Even when dealing with a fragile woman like you." The sentence was like a silent knife cutting into her thoughts. Barlow, that name was familiar. Her father had said, if anyone wanted to take over Maple Hollow, it would be him. Fear rose, but Marian did not let it win. When the third man lunged at her again, she spun away, sliding onto the wet ground and rolling straight into the darkness under a nearby carriage. Dirt clung to her clothes and hair, but she paid it no mind. A gunshot rang out. But not directed at them. She pulled the pistol from her leather pouch, the only thing her father had given her before he died, and fired a warning shot right at the leader's feet. The bullet lodged in the ground, splashing mud and water up his trousers. The thunder behind her seemed to emphasize her determination. There was a moment of tense silence. Then the leader growled softly, "Do you really think you can fight us alone, Marian?" Her heart pounding so hard she couldn't breathe, kept the gun aimed at him. "I just need enough time to get out of here." "That's enough." Another flash of lightning, and this time it illuminated Marian's gaze, not fear and despair, but a will forged by years of silent suffering. It was a moment that made older viewers feel sympathy for her, but she never seemed weak. They saw in Marian the image of everyday women able to endure but also stand tall when needed. He sneered and was about to step forward. But someone's footsteps sounded behind them. Slowly, decisively. No need to threaten, no need to rush. The air changed as if even the rain stopped to listen. The three men turned their heads. A tall figure stood at the edge of the light, a wide-brimmed hat half covering his face. He wore a sodden leather cloak, and in his right hand he held an old Winchester rifle held with care like an old trusty object. The late-morning lightning flashed across his straight nose and calm eyes. No aggression, no show of strength, just the composure of someone used to standing between right and wrong. And in the sound of rain beating down on the patchy tin roof, Marian realized sometimes in the darkest moments of a person's life, fate still leaves a small, light, gentle quiet to let us know we are not fighting alone. The rain continued to fall in long, thin strands, like someone sewing needles across the dark sky of the border town. For a moment Marian could only hear her own breathing, short, rapid, and propelled by unfinished fear. The three men paused before the tall figure advancing toward them, as if this harsh land had just called to them a familiar force of justice. The man who emerged from the storm had the quiet air of someone who has traveled too many miles alone. Jonah Reed, whose name the people of Sagebrush County spoke with a half-sigh of respect, stood there with a Winchester in his hand, the barrel tilted toward the ground in a silent warning. He didn't say anything right away. He didn't point his gun at anyone. But there are some people who standing tall in the middle of a storm is enough to make the bad guys stop. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating Jonah's face, a sharp jaw, eyes as gray as the mountains, and the tired expression of someone who has suffered loss but still tries to hold on to life. He had the fortitude that the elders called the tenacity of a generation that is no longer many, a quality that made Marian, though still trembling, feel held by a fragile faith. Jonah glanced at the men before suddenly speaking, his voice low and not high. Three men surrounding a lone woman. Do you think that's something worth showing off to your parents? Not provocations, not threats, just the cool, collected demeanor of a man asking the right question at the right time. The leader clenched his jaw. This has nothing to do with you, Reed. Jonah tilted his head, his eyes meeting his. In this land, anything that threatens a woman's life concerns me. A light sentence, but made the air vibrate. Marian tightened her grip on the pistol, feeling her hand tremble less. Older audiences hearing this often felt a quiet appreciation for Jonah's image. Evoked the appearance of men from the Old West, strong in action but kind in every breath. The second man muttered something, then made to draw his knife. Jonah just raised the Winchester slightly, not to the point of pointing it at anyone, but enough to let all three of them know that the line between recklessness and stupidity was now just a step. "Back off," he said, his voice unchanged. The three bad guys looked at each other silently, calculating something. Then, like a pack of wolves encountering an old bear that doesn't want to bite but won't back down, they decided to retreat. Before turning away, the leader left a sentence, both a defeat and a warning. "Barlow's men won't let this go." "Reed." Jonah didn't answer. He just watched them disappear through the warehouse, the sound of rain replacing their footsteps. When there was no one else left but them and the sky was overcast, Jonah lowered his gun, approaching Marian with the caution of someone who did not want to alarm her further. "Miss Hale." His voice was low, softer than when he faced her. "Take slow breaths. You're safe now." Marian felt her eyes water, and not from the rain. For years she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone say to her, "You're safe." It wasn't weakness, but a relief from the hardship she had endured alone. I was trying to protect myself," Marian said, her voice choked but steady. "I didn't want to be a burden to anyone." Jonah looked down at the stone, still at her heel, then at the pistol in her hand. Something like respect passed through his eyes. "I see," he replied softly. "You've been tougher than most people I've ever met. In the flickering light of the station, he handed her a clean towel from his coat pocket. To wipe your hands. Wet ground can make you cold. Marian took it, her heart suddenly ached. This man, although tall and able to fight, had a gentleness in every small action that made people unable to help but trust him. He looked toward the dark corner where the men had run, his eyebrows furrowed slightly. You said his name right, Barlow, Jonah whispered. I recognize one of those guys. He used to work for Edwin Barlow on Pine Ridge. Marian clenched her fists. So, they really were sent to find me. The sun had not yet set, but the sky was covered with dark clouds, making the world seem to shrink into a heavy darkness. Jonah stood beside her, not pressing questions, not making decisions for her, just standing there, a landmark in this barren land. After a few long seconds, he said, his voice tempered by witnessing injustice, they shouldn't have touched you. And I won't let it happen again. Marian looked at him. In the last light of the rain-soaked afternoon, she saw something strange, not a honeyed promise nor a heroic savior, but a voice that spoke from his heart, a man of an earlier generation for whom standing on the right side was a duty, not a favor. Thank you, she said softly. Jonah nodded, tipping his hat slightly as a man in the West would greet a woman with respect. It's pouring. I'll get you out of Willow Gap before they come back. He looked toward the dirt road leading away from the station. Where you're going next? Is it safe? Marian paused. I'm on my way to Maple Hollow. That's where my father left his last estate. Jonah was silent for a second, long enough to convey that the name evoked something unspeakable. Maple Hollow is a beautiful place, he finally replied. But it's not as peaceful as it looks. Barlow has had his eye on it for a long time. The words were like a cold wind blowing through Marian's body, but this time she didn't feel alone in facing them. Jonah brought a horse from the station stables, secured the saddle, and turned to take Marian's hand as she mounted. The gesture was slow, unhurried, a care that a woman who had suffered loss like her could recognize and appreciate. They began to leave Willow Gap as the last drops of rain turned to a thin mist on the meadow, and the sound of hooves hitting the ground was the slow pulse of a long, weary day. After walking a distance, Jonah turned to her, his voice low, almost a whisper in the wind. Miss Marian, from now on you won't have to struggle alone anymore. Those words in the midst of the purple fields under the fading storm made Marian's eyes moisten. Not because she needed someone to save her, but because for the first time in years she felt like she had someone walking beside her without asking for conditions, without judging her past. Just accompaniment. In that silence, older audiences can easily feel a very familiar warmth, like seeing a youthful image of someone who knew how to stand up for what is right with all their heart. And as the dirt road fades into the night mist, Marian has no idea that her journey with Jonah will lead her to new memories, old fears, and a town called Redhaven where her destiny begins to unfold quietly but dramatically. The rain had stopped by the time Marian and Jonah reached the eastern border of Redhaven. The morning light drifted slowly down over the faded wooden roofs, illuminating the old signs worn by the highland winds over the years. The red dust that was characteristic of this land covered every step, every carriage, every tavern door like a thin layer of memory that time could not bear to erase. Marian tugged at her shawl and looked around. Redhaven was not bustling. It lived at its own pace, slow and proud, as if it knew it had once been a bright spot on the map of Western exploration and still wanted to retain some of that dignity. The townspeople stopped what they were doing when they saw the two riders enter. It wasn't the same critical or harsh stares that other towns had given Marian. Here their gazes were genuine curiosity, mixed with a vague sympathy. The elders inclined their heads slightly as if they understood that whoever came to Redhaven had a story that couldn't be told right away. A gentle wind blew by, stirring up dust that turned crimson in the golden sunlight, a beauty that those who have lived half a lifetime will find nostalgic, like seeing an old scene from a film of their youth. Jonah turned and whispered, Redhaven hasn't had any visitors in a long time, but they're nice. Don't worry. Marian nodded, but her heart still pounded as she felt as if the whole town was reading her secret. She was not used to the attention, much less the gentle, uncompromising gaze. A white-bearded old man playing chess under the porch approached, squinted at Jonah, and smiled with half his face. Reed, where do you bring this trouble? He looked at Marian. This girl doesn't look like she's from around here. Jonah simply replied, she's on her way to Maple Hollow. I'm just escorting her. The old man nodded, his face slowly, understanding something that young people often don't understand. As they dismounted in front of the town's largest grocery store, a familiar herbal scent wafted from the corner. Marian turned and saw a small old woman sitting under a makeshift tent displaying bags of dried leaves, bottles of cold medicine, and a jar of homemade balm. Her lips were lined with age, but her eyes were as bright as the embers of a winter fireplace. She looked at Marian for a long time, then called softly, "My child, this land is not as gentle as it looks." Her voice seemed to carry the echoes of years of witnessing sad things happen to strangers who set foot here. Her reminder was not a threat, but like a skinny hand placed on someone's shoulder, reminding them that the most peaceful place is often where the storm is about to come. Marian bowed her head slightly and replied respectfully, "Thank you. I will be careful." The old woman smiled slightly, then placed a small bag of herbs on Marian's hand. "Soak it in warm water when you're tired. It won't cure sadness, but it will relieve headaches and help you sleep better." Marian was surprised. Everywhere she went, people sold medicine, not gave it to strangers. But in Red Haven, kindness seemed to be a thing of the past. While Jonah was tying the reins, a few villagers gathered nearby, whispering to each other. A middle-aged woman looked at Marian with a warm yet sympathetic gaze. "Hale? Is she a Hale?" "The Hale, from Maple Hollow." Marian paused. The name had been a source of pride for her family, wiped away by threats, loss, and fights she had never heard the full story of. "Yes, I am Marian Hale." A slight murmur arose, not out of disrespect, but as if they were reconnecting the thread of an old story that all Red Haven had carried. A blacksmith wiped his sweat, leaned on his hammer, and called out, "Your father, Mr. Luke Hale, is the keeper of Maple Hollow to the end. He always believed that one day his granddaughter would return." Marian choked. She had no idea her father had left such an image in this place, nor that her family's past still lived on in the memories of those who had not forgotten what was right. Another woman stepped closer and asked Jonah softly, "Mr. Reed, is she the one?" Uncle William Reed mentioned Mr. Hale's niece. Jonah bowed his head slightly. "Yes, Marian is the last of that family line." A warm silence fell. The Red Haven people did not speak much, but every glance they gave Marian seemed to give her the welcome any stranger could hope for. Marian walked along the main street, noticing every little detail: the old sign hanging crookedly in front of the church, the red, dusty boots of the cowboys mending the fence, the smell of bread baking from Estelle's shop wafting through the air like a peaceful invitation. She suddenly heard whispering behind her. "That's Luke Hale's nephew. A Hale returns to Red Haven. Who knows what will happen next? I heard Barlow is trying to take over Maple Hollow." Marian looked away, but her heart still clenched. She had not yet fully understood the warnings, but they fell on her like the first heavy raindrops of a coming storm. When they stopped at the diner at the end of the street, Jonah pulled out a chair for her and silently surveyed the town. His gaze wasn't cold or defensive, but deep, like someone accustomed to listening to even the smallest details. Marian spoke slowly, as if testing each word in her heart. "Brother Jonah, why does everyone here seem to know so much about my family?" Jonah clasped his hands on the rough wooden table. "Red Haven is a small town. Its people remember kindnesses well. Your father and my uncle stood together in many matters of this valley." Marian tilted her head slightly. "Your uncle?" Jonah nodded slightly. "Willem Reed. He was considered the justice of Sagebrush Valley. He traveled around settling disputes, defending the weak, and he once said that Luke Hale was one of the kindest people he had ever met." Marian squeezed his hand. She had never heard her father speak of William, but the fact that he had left such a beautiful image made her heart sink, a feeling of both pity and pride. Jonah continued, his voice murmuring like a low fire in a stove. "He once told me, if anyone from the Hale family ever came back, we would welcome them with open arms. Because Maple Hollow is more than just land. It is the conscience of the entire neighborhood." Marian was speechless for a long time. Red Haven, with its red dust, its kind eyes, its memories of the dead, suddenly felt like a place she belonged, even though she had just arrived. And as Marian began to feel the first warmth of a seemingly foreign land, the shadow of a luxurious carriage stopped in Red Haven Square, carrying with it a chill that stopped all conversation, as if the town had just remembered a name that everyone wanted to avoid mentioning: Edwin Barlow. In the moment when Red Haven was still filled with warm curiosity for Marian, the sound of the carriage wheels grinding on the red ground suddenly broke the peaceful atmosphere. It was not loud, but enough to make every citizen in the square raise their heads as a reflex ingrained over the years. The most luxurious carriage Marian had ever seen on the border stopped just before the steps of the restaurant. Its black paint was so shiny that its silhouette could be seen even though the ground was covered in road dust. 4 snow-white horses stood still, barely breathing, trained as if they belonged to another world, a world of power, of people who would not tolerate interference. Jonah paused slightly. Not out of fear, but out of the alertness of someone who knew where this car's shadow would appear, causing trouble. The door opened. Edwin Barlow stepped down, his patent leather shoes barely showing any dust, as if the soil of Redhaven dared not cling to him. He needed no words to make it clear that he did not hide his power. He wore it like a cloak. Marian stood still, her hands unconsciously tightening the edge of her shawl. For that brief moment she could no longer hear the sounds of the people around her. Only the sound of her own heartbeat, each beat after another, echoed faintly like a reminder of the past. Because Barlow was no stranger. He was the name that had lingered in the stories her father carried with him to the end of his life, the man who wanted Maple Hollow at any cost. Barlow glanced around the town as if checking to see if his property was ready for harvest. The people of Redhaven bowed their heads, not out of respect but out of caution. The caution of men who knew trouble would come if they looked at him too long. Then his eyes stopped. Enter Marian. He looked at her longer than was politely required, long enough for the air around them to become as heavy as ashes after a fire. Miss Hale, Barlow said, his voice so soft that a passerby might not have heard it, but each word fell as sharp as a thin blade. The Hale family have always been stubborn. A sentence that sounded like the wind blowing through a cliff, cold, deep, and warning. Marian felt someone gently squeeze her shoulder. When she turned around, she saw Mrs. Estelle, the owner of the restaurant, standing behind her, her thin hand gently holding her sleeve. "Don't go near him," she whispered, so low only Marian could hear. "There have been stronger men than he in this land, but none as dangerous." Marian swallowed, trying to keep her face from changing. She had known this day would come, the day she would face the man her father had avoided all his life. But knowing was one thing. Standing before him was another. Barlow took another step, but Jonah also advanced, leaning slightly toward Marian the way men in the Old West often did to shield the person they wanted to protect. The two men's eyes met, one cold, one determined. "Reed." Barlow grinned, his smile devoid of amusement. "I didn't expect to see you here." Jonah replied evenly, not challenging but not backing down either. "Redhaven is a place anyone can come to, if they don't bring trouble with them." Barlow let out a short laugh. "I never get in trouble first, unless someone gets in my way." His implication froze the air. The Redhavenites stood further back, but no one dared move. They knew this moment would decide many things. Marian raised her voice, though her throat was dry. "Mr. Barlow, if you came here just to threaten me, then I have nothing to say." Barlow tilted his head, examining Marian as if she were a precious object he had long lost. "You have more to say than you think, Miss Hale." His eyes glanced down at her hand, where the herbal handkerchief the old woman had given her was still loosely held. "Maple Hollow is not a place for those who dream of peace." Jonah wanted to step forward, but Marian gently placed her hand on his arm, signaling that she wanted to stand on her own 2 feet. "That land was my father's," she said, "and now it's mine." Barlow looked at her one more long moment, then turned away as if the conversation were over. But just before he got into the car, he said without turning around, "There are always more than one way to own a piece of land. Remember that, Marian." The car door closed with a heavy click, like the end of a chapter that had just opened. The carriage rolled out of the square, leaving a trail of red dust swirling in the air. But the cold remained, clinging to every eaves and every window. Estelle sighed, squeezing Marian's hand gently. "Your father and I defended that land with honor. Now, it seems it's your turn." Marian did not answer immediately. The wind from Maple Hollow blew down, causing the hem of her dress to flutter. There was a very human fear in her, but also something awakening like a small fire in the prairie night. Jonah stood beside him, silent for a long time. Then he said, softly but firmly, "Barlow won't stop. But she's not alone." Marian looked into his eyes, gray eyes as calm as an autumn lake. She saw no empty promises there, only the certainty of someone who had chosen to stand by her side without being asked. It was a moment that touched the old man, for it harked back to a time when a man's loyalty did not need to be declared aloud. And it was that elegant shadow when it left Redhaven, leaving behind a silence that made Marian understand that the road to Cedar Hollow, the farm her father had kept, would not only be a return trip, but a journey to touch memories that had never been fully spoken. Redhaven receded behind her, the red dust falling to the road like a silent farewell from a town that knew more than it said. Marian settled herself in the saddle, her hands holding the reins firmly enough yet softly enough for the horse to feel her breath. The rain had stopped long ago, but the air after the storm still smelled of damp earth, the familiar smell of journeys one remembers in old age. Jonah rode alongside her, his horse moving slowly the way of someone who doesn't want to rush anything, whether danger or peace. The afternoon sunlight fell on his shoulders, dyeing the dust of the road a pale gold evocative of a feeling all too familiar. Older audiences hearing this part might easily think of men of old few words but present at the right time like a landmark in the wilderness. The road to Cedar Hollow was longer than Marian had expected. It wound along thinly wooded hillsides past honey-colored meadows and pine trees that stood still as if listening to strangers passing through their land. Occasionally a meadowlark would soar from the brush, startling Marian, but Jonah kept his voice even. "It's okay. This land can be noisy like that sometimes." She smiled slightly, though her mind was still haunted by the shadow that had swept over Redhaven. Barlow hadn't touched her, but his words were like a line she knew she would have to cross sooner or later. Jonah seemed to understand this. After a long while he spoke in a low, slow voice as if talking to himself. "I used to go to Cedar Hollow with Uncle William a few times, when I was a kid. He and your father Luke were the rare two who knew how to behave without anyone teaching them." Marian looked over silently, waiting for him to continue. Being with Jonah, she learned that silence is sometimes the best way to open the door to each other's hearts. Jonah continued. "My uncle once said, there are lands that do not need fences to protect them, because they are built by the hands of people who believe in goodness." He paused for a moment as if remembering every old detail. Cedar Hollow is such a place. Marian's heart ached as she listened. She knew little about the land she was about to enter, the land her father considered the last of the Hale family. Her lack of knowledge tormented her like a child returning too late to the anniversary of a parent's death. Jonah saw it in her eyes. "It is not your fault for being late, Marian. Those who have weathered many storms often do not choose their time of return." A saying as light as the spring breeze, but enough to move older listeners because they understand better than anyone the value of tolerance, especially towards themselves. The path began to climb as they approached the large boulders that marked the boundary of Cedar Hollow. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the ground as if the memories of those who had gone before were still there, waiting for them to return. Finally, the house appeared, a simple wooden house with a low porch built on a gentle slope overlooking the valley. The wind passed through the wooden planks, creating a soft sound like the whisper of a deceased person. Marian's heart clenched. She dismounted, her feet touching the ground, and it felt like she was touching a part of herself. The rocking chair on the porch was still there. The back was worn, showing the shape of someone who had once sat there reading letters, newspapers, or just watching the seasons change. Marian reached out and touched it lightly. The coldness of the old wood made her shiver, but there was also a strange warmth, as if her father had left the imprint of his hand there. Jonah stood behind, slowly removing his hat, paying his respects to the place where his beloved had once stood. "Uncle William used to sit here with your father," he said. "They shared more than they ever told us." Marian couldn't help but sigh. A sigh mixed with regret for not having come sooner to hear those stories from the living. She walked into the house. Inside, everything seemed as if it had been left untouched since Mr. Luke had last left the door. The wooden table had a faint mark from a drink. A small bookcase held an old Bible, its spine frayed, evidently much used in the last years of its life. Beside it was a quill pen with some dried ink on it, and on the table, a half-written letter placed neatly, as if someone had just left for a moment, intending to come back and continue writing. Marian trembled as she opened the paper. "My Marian, if you're reading this, I probably don't have enough time to tell you everything. I've never forgotten our years together. Maple Hollow, there's still a path for you if you want it, and Cedar Hollow will always be the home I believe you deserve." The handwriting stopped mid-sentence, as if time had pulled it away from the writer's hand. Marian raised her hand to her lips, trying to suppress a sob. It wasn't a violent sob, but a warm pain, the pain of someone recovering a part of a memory they thought was lost. Jonah stood in the doorway, silently respecting the moment. He only spoke when he saw that she had calmed down. "Your father left this place to someone he believed would continue to preserve its value, not because of the land, but because of the kindness that was built on this land. Marian nodded slightly. And the way back? It may never be too late, she whispered as if to her father. Outside, the sun poured golden sunlight onto the porch. The wind from Maple Hollow carried the scent of hay mixing with the emptiness in her chest, then gently filling it with something else, hope. And as Marian stood in the middle of that house filled with memories, Jonah walked in from the back shed holding an old leather-bound book, something he said he found in Luke's trunk. His eyes were heavy as if the pages held something not only from the past, but also waiting for them ahead. The house of Cedar Hollow still smelled of dry pine and the warmth of years when Luke Hale's hands had touched each plank. Marian sat down at the old wooden table where her father's unfinished letter still lay, a silent witness to the past she had just found. Her heart still felt the gentle stirring of a moment of facing memories, the kind of nostalgia that makes older people easily quiet, not because of sadness but because they realize that love can remain in the smallest things. Jonah entered through the back doorway. He didn't speak right away. His shadow stretched across the floor as the afternoon sun peeked through the back door. The sensation a man entering a house filled with so many memories made Marian feel like time slowed down a beat. In Jonah's hand was a dark brown leather-bound notebook, the corners of the cover frayed to the point of near snap. "Marian," he called softly, his deep voice carrying like a cello in the empty room. "I found this in Luke's trunk, among some old things." Marian stood up and walked closer. When her fingers touched the book, the leather felt cool, as if it carried the breath of time. The pages inside were yellow, many of them blurred by rain or sweat from long journeys. She turned each page one by one, feeling as if she were turning back the pages of her life from years she had never known. Her father's words, neat but strong, appeared in the sunlight slanting through the window. "Cedar Hollow is the soul of the valley. If you come back one day, you will understand." The next page contained notes on a geological map of Maple Hollow. The lines were straight and clear, drawn by Luke himself. Lines ran from the edge of the woods down into the valley, and then into an area marked in hasty handwriting. Marian frowned. "What is this?" Jonah stood close by, his eyes narrowing as he remembered something he had heard years ago. "My father and uncle used to study this area. They suspected that there was a natural coal mine deep underground." Marian looked more closely. A thick line ran from Cedar Hollow's land to another area, land that everyone in Sagebrush County knew belonged to Edwin Barlow. As if to confirm what was slowly forming in her, Jonah sighed. "Barlow wants the valley, even if it has to burn to get it." The sentence was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the air in the house suddenly thicken, as if every molecule understood that a tragedy had long been written. Marian stroked the last page, where Mr. Luke's scribbled handwriting appeared slanted to the right, trembling slightly. "If anything happens to me, remember Barlow is closer than you think." Marian's hand stopped. A chill ran down her spine, then stopped at her heart, which was pounding in warning. "My father knew about this." Her voice was so low that only Jonah could hear. He nodded, his eyes sad. "Luke and Uncle William tried to prove that Barlow was illegally digging under the boundary, but they didn't have enough evidence. And Barlow had too many people behind him." Marian turned the book over and placed it in her palm as if cradling her father's last words. "Is it because of this that you were threatened?" Jonah was silent. In that silence, every answer was clearer than any spoken word. The afternoon faded into dusk. Warm, honey-colored light filtered through the windows and fell on Marian's hair, making her look like a part of this house even though she had only been in it a few hours. Each page of her father's diary took her back to his days, the long trips to town, the nights he sat alone in his rocking chair, leafing through notebooks and writing by lamplight. She felt his loneliness, a loneliness that now, as she read the warnings, she understood was not just the sadness of loss, but the pressure of a secret too great for a man to hold. Jonah leaned lightly on the table, his voice low as if choosing each word. "My uncle. Before he passed away, he also said something that never reassured me." Marian looked up. "What, there are men who would burn down an entire valley just to keep their power?" After Jonah finished speaking, there was a long silence between them, only the sound of the wind blowing through the crack in the door. Something very real, very heavy hung over their shoulders, not mere fear, but the feeling that they were standing on the edge between the past and the imminent danger. To investigate further, Jonah took Marian to the back shed. Beneath the floorboards, he opened a small compartment covered with an old wooden board. Beneath was a metal box containing papers, topographic maps, soil surveys, and a few scribbled notes. Among them was a more detailed map, hand-drawn apparently by Mr. Luke himself. Marian touched it with a trembling hand. Natural tunnels ran from Cedar Hollow through the thin rock and opened up right under Barlow's property. "Barlow doesn't just want your land," Jonah said. "He wants all the coal that lies beneath the valley. And he knows that if he gets it, he gets everything." Marian looked at the map as if looking into the heart of the land her father had fought so hard to keep. "So, what should I do?" she asked, her voice both firm and trembling slightly. Jonah placed his hand on the map, but not touching hers, just close enough for her to feel his steady presence. "We will find a way to protect what your father left behind. But first, you must understand the truth." Marian took a deep breath. For the first time since returning to Cedar Hollow, she felt like she was more than just the heir to an old house. She was inheriting an unfinished fight, a fight for the honor and decency of the people who had lived and died on this land. And she knew her journey from here would not be easy, but it was a journey she would no longer walk alone. As Marian closed her diary, the sound of a harp drifted from the town, the sound signaling the start of Red Haven's autumn festival. She knew she had to return, not just to join the community, but to find answers in the eyes of those who had witnessed Barlow and her father's past. The night of the Red Haven Fall Festival came as softly as the first breath of winter, not cold enough to make people shiver, but enough to draw their cloaks closer and feel the warmth of the lanterns lining the main street. Returning to town from Cedar Hollow, Marian sat behind Jonah on horseback, watching the orange-gold lights shimmer in the darkness. Red Haven had never looked so bright, or perhaps it was the openness of her heart that made it all seem different. The townspeople had hung dozens of paper lanterns on ropes that ran between the roofs of their houses. The night breeze gently swayed them, creating a picturesque scene, streaks of light swaying against the deep purple sky, illuminating the faces of old people chatting, children running around, and couples walking slowly side by side. Marian stood in that light and suddenly felt like she was touching a part of her life she never knew she longed for. Jonah tied up his horse and turned to her, his eyes as calm as an autumn lake. "They'll be glad to see you here. Every year there's something missing at the festival. Maybe tonight they'll get some of it back." Marian chuckled, a small but bright laugh. "I'm afraid I'm not used to crowded places like this." "It's okay," Jonah replied warmly. "I'm here with you." A gentle saying, not promising, but with a certainty that makes the listener feel at peace. The elderly often smile when hearing this, because it is the gentleness they understand. Not ostentatious, not hasty, but lasting like the land of the West. Music rang out from the middle of the square, violins, guitars, and the click of shoes on the floor. Old couples held hands and twirled around their steps, slow but graceful, as if they had been dancing together all their lives. Jonah held out his hand to Marian. "Do you want to try?" She looked at that hand for a long moment, the tanned, steady hand that had saved her in the storm at Willow Gap. Finally, as if it were her own heart, she placed her hand in his. They stepped into the circle, swaying to the slow music. Marian was a little hesitant at first, but Jonah led with quiet patience. One step, then a gentle turn. The scents of pine night, grass, and dry road dust mingled together, creating an atmosphere that was both nostalgic and strangely peaceful. In that moment, Marian felt like she belonged here, belonged to this feeling. But then, like a streak of cloud covering the bright moon, Marian's eyes caught Edwin Barlow standing in the shadows behind the tavern. He did not join in the festivities. He stood still, hands in the pockets of his long coat, his cold eyes fixed on her. Not a look of jealousy, not of anger, but of possessiveness, as if Cedar Hollow, Maple Hollow, and even her fate were all part of his silent calculations. Marian's hand tightened on Jonah's, making him look in that direction. Jonah saw him. Two gazes, one silently protective, one silently threatening, intersected in the darkness. "Keep the pace," Jonah said softly, his voice calm but with the depth of a man preparing to face danger. "Don't let him ruin the moment." Marian tried to keep going along the circle, but her heart was pounding harder than before. Her father's words in his diary echoed back to her. "Barlow is closer than you think." After a few laps, they broke away from the crowd to get some air. Mr. Rufus Hale, an elderly blacksmith, approached Jonah, patted him on the shoulder, then glanced at Marian. "Reed," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Barlow won't leave this Hale girl alone." Jonah replied, his voice even and unwavering, "I know." Rufus sighed, looking at Marian, with the deep compassion of someone who had witnessed years of injustice in the valley. "Girl, You need to understand this. Barlow never spares those who dare stand between him and what he wants." Marian thanked him with a small nod, but there was something in her eyes that reassured Rufus, a steadiness that was forming like a bud pushing through dry soil after a long winter. The night deepened. The lanterns glowed like tiny galaxies suspended in the sky. Marian and Jonah stood side by side at the edge of the square, enjoying the rare moment of peace. "Jonah," she said softly, "I'm scared. But not for myself. I'm scared for Cedar Hollow. Scared that if I get there too late, it will all be over." Jonah turned to look at her, his gray eyes as soft as an autumn lake. "It's not too late while you're here," he replied. "Cedar Hollow doesn't need the strongest. It needs someone who truly loves it. And you're back, that's what matters most." Marian looked down at her hands. In the lantern light they looked small, but they were also growing stronger by the minute. "Do you really think I can face Barlow?" she asked. "I think," Jonah said slowly, "you don't have to face this alone." That gentle word made Marian feel a warmth in her chest, not because of a sweet promise, but because of a steadfast presence she had never felt before in her life. But every beautiful night in the West also hides a trace of darkness. As the festival was coming to a close, a villager ran up to Jonah, whispering something that made his face darken. Marian looked in the direction he pointed. At the edge of town, near the road leading back to Cedar Hollow, strange, deep new tire tracks. Not Redhaven carts, not caravan carts, and certainly not random passing carts. Marian felt her feet go cold. Jonah spoke softly, but each word seemed to rest on heavier ground than stone. "Barlow didn't just come to warn me. He's already started to act." And as the last lantern of the festival was blown out and darkness fell upon Redhaven, Marian felt in her heart that Cedar Hollow, the home that had just given her hope, was about to face the fire her father had tried to protect to the last minute. As the last lantern of the Redhaven festival was extinguished, the sky seemed to be covered with a thick black curtain of late autumn night. Marian and Jonah had not long left the square when the wind began to change direction. A strong wind blew from the Maple Hollow Valley, carrying with it a distant burnt smell. It was just a faint suspicion at first, but both of their instincts were taut like a bowstring drawn to its full length. Jonah pulled back on his horse, tilting his head to listen. "Do you feel something strange on the wind?" Marian squinted toward the road back to Cedar Hollow. A faint red glow blurred the darkness, or so her frightened eyes imagined. But then a flash of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the entire valley for a moment. And in that moment, Marian saw it. A column of black smoke, then a tall, curling flame like a soul torn from the earth. No, her exclamation was carried away by the wind like a piece of her heart that had just fallen. Jonah didn't need to ask. He urged his horse forward, his voice firm yet gentle as he addressed her. "Marian, hold on. We have to get there now." The road back to Cedar Hollow was dark except for flashes of lightning that lit up the cliffs and bushes. The wind was so strong that the pine trees beside the road swayed as if nature itself were warning of the pain that lay ahead. It wasn't just rain. It was coming in long, stinging sheets. The wind howled, whipping Marian's face and shirt, forcing her to duck close to Jonah's back to avoid being blown over. But nothing, not rain, not wind, could stop her from charging toward the flames that were eating away at Cedar Hollow. As they got closer, the dry crack of burning wood mixed with the rumble of thunder, as if heaven and earth were witnessing something that should not be happening. Cedar Hollow, the home her father left her, the Hale family fire, is on fire. Marian jumped off her horse before it had time to stop. Her feet were muddy and she slipped a few steps, but she kept running as if her very breath depended on reaching the house. "Marian, wait," Jonah called after her, but didn't stop her. He understood that sometimes pain had to be faced head-on, that there was no way to hold someone safe when their heart burned brighter than the fire in front of them. The whole house was red with fire. The porch where the rocking chair had stood that afternoon now collapsed, burning into crackling embers. Marian collapsed when she saw the remains of the chair. It was where Mr. Luke had sat reading his letters, where he had spent his last days. Now there was only a charred mass of wood, half burned and crumbling to ash. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She just cupped her face in her hands and shook her head slightly, as if denying that the fire had erased her father's last memory. Anyone older who has ever lost a home or a loved one knows the moment it's not loud, but the rift inside is so deep that it takes a lifetime to repair. Jonah came to her side, knelt down, and placed his hands on her shoulders without saying a word. His silence, the silence of a man who had lost, was what kept Marian from completely breaking down. She wiped her face, trying to stand up. "Jonah, who did this?" He didn't reply. Instead, he held the lantern and shone it around the less burnt area at the edge of the yard. There, under the mud puddle created by the heavy rain, was a clear trail of footprints. Big, deep, hard. Jonah bent down and touched the edge of the shoe print. His eyes changed color. "These are not Red Haven boots," he said slowly, "nor the kind worn by herdsmen." He looked up at Marian, the lamplight reflecting cold certainty. "These are mercenary boots, the kind Edwin Barlow used to rent from western Sagebrush County." Marian felt like someone grabbed her heart and squeezed. "So, Jonah nodded. "No doubt about it." A clap of thunder boomed above them, lighting up the sky. In the light, Marian saw Cedar Hollow give its final tilt before a massive beam collapsed, sending a column of fire soaring to the clouds. She covered her mouth, took a step back, her eyes red. Jonah stepped closer, his voice low but soft. "Marian, I'm sorry, but we have to get out of here. The storm is getting stronger and the house could collapse at any moment." She didn't answer. She stood there watching the flames consume what remained of her father. The rain hit her face, mixing with the heat of the fire, stinging her skin, but she didn't back away. That fire burned not only the house, it burned the life she had not yet touched. After a long while, she said softly, "He wants to send a message." Jonah nodded slowly. "Yes, he wants you to know that he is not afraid, and that he can take anything if you do not leave this valley." Marian clenched her fists until they turned white, and he thought, "I would run." For the first time that night, Jonah looked straight at her with eyes that were not just worried, but proud. "But she won't." Marian turned to the house, collapsing in the flames. The flames illuminated her face, turning her pain into quiet determination, the kind of strength only those who have lost everything can understand. "No," she whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." And as the last flames died on the wet ground, Marian understood that tonight's loss was not an end, but a calling that Red Haven, those quiet but loving people, were about to answer in the way her father had believed. Cedar Hollow was engulfed in a firestorm that lasted until nearly dawn. When the last rain fell, the flickering flames died down, leaving wet ash and charred wood scattered like torn memories. Marian stood there the whole time, never leaving, as if her heart were still trapped in the glowing embers. Jonah didn't leave her side, just stood silently beside her, letting his presence be a support for the unspeakable pain. As the sky lightened and the early birds began to sing, they turned back toward Red Haven. No one spoke a word along the long journey, but the silence itself was like a soft cotton scarf draped lightly over the shoulders of those who had just suffered a loss not immediately healing but keeping them from the cold. The news of Cedar Hollow's burning spread faster than the morning wind. Before Marian and Jonah reached the top of Red Haven Street, dozens of people had gathered, standing in rows on the sidewalk, their faces full of grief. Marian was surprised to see that Mrs. Estelle, the owner of the restaurant, was the first to step forward. She hugged her without saying anything, just giving her a very gentle pat on the back, the pat of those who have lived through much pain and know that words are sometimes not enough. "Daughter," she whispered, "last night the valley wept with you." Marian felt her throat tighten, but she tried to keep calm. "Thank you. I don't know what to do next." "You don't have to do it alone," Estelle replied, squeezing her hand. One by one, the Red Haven people approached. Some brought good old roofing. Others brought planks of wood. Others brought blankets, pots and pans, leftover household items. No one spoke loudly. No one boasted. They simply set their objects down near her and nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mr. Rufus, the old blacksmith, placed a pine beam on the ground, then looked straight into Marian's eyes. "Your father helped Uncle William rebuild the barn after that storm. Today, it's our turn to return the favor." Marian could only bow her head slightly. No tears fell, but her heart softened, as if comforted by a warmth she had long since dreamed she deserved. Another old man, slender with white hair, eyes dim but bright with experience, stepped forward. He put his hand on Marian's shoulder, a thin but firm one. "I'm Mr. Whitman, 78 years old. I just want to say, we lost a good man when Mr. Luke left. We won't lose another Hale girl." Marian took his hand, feeling like she was touching a part of her father that remained in this town. While everyone else was exchanging supplies, Jonah took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and began selecting good lumber. He inspected every shingle, every nail, every plank, not hastily but with the determination of someone accustomed to rebuilding a life from the ruins. "What are you going to do?" Marian asked softly. Jonah looked at her for a second longer than usual, then replied, "Build a shelter. Give her a place to stay. Last night, a lot burned. We can't let anything else go." He worked without stopping. The hammering was steady, not loud, but very steady. People took turns helping. Some whittled the wood, some held the posts, some brought nails, and some repaired the old windows. The way they do it is like a ritual, not an isolated act of charity, but a coming together of people who see each other as family. Marian stood watching, a rare tenderness welling up in her heart. A gratitude not just for Jonah, but for all of Red Haven. She realized, some losses don't take everything away. They open up a space for other hands to reach out and fill. When the little pine house was raised enough to provide shelter from the wind, Mrs. Estelle brought a basket of toast and a pot of hot coffee. Worked all morning time to eat and regain strength. She spoke in a tone that was half reproachful, half sympathetic. In her eyes, Marian saw the silhouettes of generations of Western women, those who knew how to endure but also knew how to extend their arms to protect when needed. Marian was invited to sit in a circle of workers, innkeepers, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, all of whom considered each other as family. For the first time since arriving in Sagebrush County, she felt like she belonged. Jonah sat beside her, his hands still stained with pine tar. He held out a piece of bread to her, his gaze warm but uninvasive. "You should eat something. We have to go back to Cedar Hollow this afternoon to see what we can save." Marian nodded slightly. "I can't thank you. And everyone. Enough." Jonah just smiled. "You don't need to thank me. Just stay." A simple sentence, but enough to make the elderly choke up when they hear it. Because in these lands, sometimes the invitation to stay is the deepest love one can say. When lunch was over, Mr. Whitman approached Marian again. His voice was soft but firm. "Little girl, don't think Cedar Hollow is lost. Earth may burn, houses may fall, but hearts will not. As long as you're here, it means we still have hope to rebuild everything." Marian swallowed down her rising emotions. "I will do my best, sir." "No," he corrected, his eyes sparkling, "you will not try alone. All Red Haven will go with you." As the sun began to tilt over the mountains, Marian thought the worst of the day was over. But just as the town was packing up, a strange man limped into town, his clothes torn, his shoulders bloody, his eyes full of panic. And at a glance, Jonah knew he brought the truth Cedar Hollow had waited so long for. The Red Haven afternoon passed with the soft hammering and the greetings of the people. Marian's makeshift home had a roof to shield it from the wind, and that made her feel less shaken by the night of loss. But as the sun drifted over the mountains, a different feeling began to creep in, a feeling that what lay ahead was not just rebuilding but also confronting what her father had left behind in his old diaries. Jonah was gathering his tools when the sound of faltering footsteps came from up the street. Marian turned and saw a man struggling to keep his balance, staggering as if pushed against him by a strong wind. His shirt was torn, his face pale, the panicked look in his eyes of someone who had been running for a long time without daring to look back. Jonah stepped forward quickly, his eyes wary but his voice calm. "Who are you? What's going on?" The man gasped, looked around as if afraid someone was chasing him, then was able to speak out loud. "I am Merrick Cole. I need to see Miss Hale." Marian paused for a beat. The name was not in her memory, but something in the way he said it made her feel this was not some random stranger passing through Red Haven. Jonah helped Merrick to a makeshift wooden chair. Mrs. Estelle brought a jug of water, and Mr. Whitman stood nearby, his eyes full of concern. No one pushed the man away. At Red Haven, people in distress were always welcomed before being asked any questions. When he had caught his breath, Merrick looked up at Marian. His eyes held a deep fear, the fear of someone who had lived in the darkness for so long that he could finally bear it no longer. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling, I used to work for Edwin Barlow." The air around them stopped as when a wind suddenly stops before a mountain. His accountant, Merrick, continued, "and the one who handles the paperwork he doesn't want anyone to see." Marian felt her heart slow each beat as if weighing what she was about to hear. "Why did you come to me?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Merrick took from his shirt a piece of paper folded many times, its edges frayed from long handling. He handed it to Marian with both hands, as if handing over a burden he could no longer hold. Marian opened the piece of paper. It's a strong, rough, slanted handwriting, unmistakable. Finish the Hale story before winter. The words were short but heavy as a condemnation. Marian had to grip the edge of the paper to keep her hand from shaking. Jonah stood beside him, his gray eyes dark. Mr. Whitman shook his head slightly, sighing as if he had long feared this but refused to believe it was true. Merrick bent down, his hands clasped together. You're not the only one he's after, he said. You're just the last piece. Barlow wants Cedar Hollow, wants Maple Hollow, and he wants the water in the valley. Marian frowned. You said water source. Merrick nodded vigorously. That's right. The coal mine is just one part. Barlow has been hiring surveyors for the past 3 years. He knows that if he can control the water that flows under Maple Hollow, he can control Sagebrush County. From the farms to the towns, they will all be at his mercy. A long, heavy silence. Marian felt her feet go cold. Not from the wind, but from the realization that the fight her father had fought was about more than the mine. It was about the survival of the entire valley. Jonah spoke slowly, each word sharp. Mr. Cole, if you knew so much, why did you leave him? Out of fear. Merrick smiled weakly. A smile without joy. Fear and regret. He raised his head, looking at Marian with a sincerity rarely seen in someone who had gone astray. I knew Mr. Luke. He was kind to everyone who came to Cedar Hollow. When I learned he was dead, I realized I had kept quiet for too long. Merrick paused, his voice choked. If I don't do something now, I'll do the worst thing in my life all over again. The elders present bowed their heads, not in judgment but in understanding. Late repentance was better than prolonged silence, and sometimes a confession was the first step towards saving a land. Marian folded the letter, holding it between her hands as if holding her father's last whisper in an old diary. Mr. Cole, she said, her voice soft but strong, everything you just said. Does my father know? Merrick swallowed hard. Luke knew Barlow was digging illegally. But you didn't know. He wanted control of the water. No one knew that but me. I hid it, until I realized that if I stayed, I would be used as a piece of wood in the next fire. Marian took a deep breath, as if gathering her father's courage from her memory. You came to Red Haven today because you wanted to stand on the side of truth. Yes, Merrick replied without hesitation. Jonah put a hand on his shoulder. Then from now on, you are no longer alone. The words, so simple, so unpretentious, made Merrick bow his head, tears falling onto his trembling hands. No one around criticized. No one turned away. Because in this land, genuine repentance is always seen as a chance to start over. Marian looked at Jonah, then at the Red Haven people standing silently around her. She realized something. Cedar Hollow may have been lost in the fire, but hope was not. Not when truth found its way back. By the time Marian tucked the letter into her pocket, the sky was already the color of late afternoon, and she knew Merrick's confession was not the end, but the beginning. Barlow would not stop, and Red Haven and Jonah would have to face him before winter descended on the valley. After Merrick Cole had told the whole truth, Red Haven lost its small town quiet. Not noise, not panic, but a different, determined silence. Men stood in small groups outside Estelle's shop, exchanging glances more than words. Women tied scarves and prepared food for those who would ascend the mountain. And in the midst of it all, Marian stood still, clutching Barlow's letter like a guiding thread through the valley. Jonah approached. He wore a faded cowboy hat, a heavier-than-usual coat, and a lantern hanging from his waist that swung with each step. Marian, he said, his voice calm but with a barely concealed determination, Barlow has left the manor. He is heading up the North Crest Mountains. The snow has already arrived there. Marian squeezed the piece of paper in her hand. Are you going with the pursuit team? Jonah looked at her for a long time, the look of a man who doesn't want to look away but knows there are some confrontations that cannot be avoided. I'll go, he said, for your father, for Cedar Hollow, and for what's right. The elderly often nod when they hear this because they understand the traditional moral. Sometimes justice is not spoken but is shown by where we stand at the crucial moment. Marian took a deep breath, then nodded slightly. I trust you, Jonah. I trust Redhaven. Jonah put his hat back on, touched her shoulder, not a promise, not a comfort, but an affirmation that she was not alone in this fight. By the time the group left town, the sky was already dark. The first snow of the season had begun to fall sporadically, each flake like cold ash falling on their shoulders. The lanterns in their hands cast a soft yellow light, illuminating just enough to see the way but not completely banishing the darkness like the fragile but persistent hope they carried with them. Jonah leads the group. Behind him are Mr. Rufus, 3 of the town's men, and Merrick, who has decided to atone for his actions. The road to Northcrest was winding wide enough for one person in parts. Each step left a print in the fresh snow, quickly obscured by the wind. The group said nothing, not because of the weight, but because of the natural silence of Westerners approaching a crucial moment. Jonah walked in the lead, the lantern light illuminating his face, highlighting his hard yet warm features. The face of a man who knows that responsibility is not about pushing himself, but about taking one step at a time in the most difficult conditions. By the time they reached the edge of the mountain, the snow was falling thicker, the wind whistling through the trees, echoing like a warning from winters past. Merrick pointed to the left flank. He knows this way. He once had people survey the old mining area. If he was cornered, he would choose to hide there. Jonah nodded, then raised his hand to signal everyone to turn off their lanterns. The group was now reduced to a few small pinpricks of light, enough to light the way without giving away their presence. They went deeper into the mountain. The air grew heavier, pressing down on each of their chests. The snow piled up underfoot, and the golden light cast a magical glow over the white patches, beautiful but also sad, like memories blown away by the wind. Finally, as he approached the entrance to the old mining area, Jonah stopped. There are footprints. Not theirs, and not covered in snow. Barlow is nearby. Jonah and Rufus moved forward, Merrick in the middle, the other 2 blocking the way. No one drew a gun, no one bothered to make a sound. They just moved forward with determination. In the darkness before the tunnel entrance, a figure appeared. Edwin Barlow. He stood tall, his cloak caked with snow, his hair blown back by the wind. Though he was being pursued, he maintained the cool confidence of someone used to giving orders, not running. Reed, said Barlow, his voice low and unwavering. I thought you were smarter than that. Jonah didn't answer. He just took a step forward, the lantern light falling on Barlow's face, revealing sharp, calculating eyes. Barlow looked around, saw the Redhaven men lined up behind Jonah. He let out a small, mirthless laugh. They really believe that girl, someone who knows nothing about this land, Jonah said, his voice calm but clear. She knew what you didn't know, that kindness can make a town stand up. Barlow narrowed his eyes, then took a half step back, his foot slipping lightly on the icy edge of the tunnel. For a moment he looked at Jonah with eyes filled with hatred, but also with a weariness he couldn't hide. Luke Hale, said Barlow, replied softly. She would be the last straw. The words slow, sharp, cold, like a chill wind sweeping through the heart of the mountain. Jonah stepped closer. You're wrong. She's our last hope. No one touched Barlow. There was no struggle, only the broken look in the eyes of the man who thought he controlled the valley. And for the first time he bowed his head. Not before guns, but before the truth he could no longer hide. As the pursuers brought Barlow down the mountain, the snow had stopped falling. The sky opened up to a pale light on the horizon, a sign of approaching dawn. Jonah walked beside Merrick. It's not over, he said. But today, the valley can breathe again. Merrick bowed his head, knowing he had just done his first good deed in years. At the end of the group, a younger Redhaven man spoke softly. Brother Jonah, Marian will be so happy. Jonah said nothing, but his hand tightened on the lantern as if grasping hope for the valley and for his own heart. And as they returned to Redhaven, the early winter dawn fell on Marian Hale's makeshift roof. In that moment, Jonah understood that there were words that could no longer wait. Words born of loss of faith and of the courage of 2 people who had each weathered their own separate winters. The morning after the pursuit returned to Redhaven, the sky was still the pale gray of the first snow, but the light was soft, as if the valley had shed a burden it had carried for too long. The news of Edwin Barlow's capture spread quickly but quietly, like the town's soft breath at the beginning of a new season. Marian was up early. She stood at the window of the makeshift shelter Jonah and the Redhaven people had built for her, looking out at Cedar Hollow still shrouded in mist. Though the loss still weighed on her heart like unsettled ash on the ground, for the first time in days she felt a pulse that wasn't just painful, it was alive. The back door opened slightly. Jonah walked in, his long coat still damp with dew, his dark brown hair a little tousled as if he hadn't combed it since leaving the house. But his eyes, they were more peaceful than Marian had ever seen them. "Can't you sleep?" he asked, his voice low and gentle like an autumn morning with the dew still on. Marian shook her head slightly. "I think a lot about what my father left behind, about Cedar Hollow, and about the people who stood up for it." Jonah moved closer, standing by the window. The morning light fell on his face, highlighting familiar features, steady, quiet, but filled with enduring kindness. "Your father used to say," Jonah whispered, "this land is only as alive as those brave enough to stay in it." The words made Marian's heart vibrate like a lightly touched string. She turned to look at Jonah and saw the change in his eyes. It wasn't just duty. It wasn't just compassion or affection. It was something deeper, softer, searching for a way to speak. Jonah was silent for a moment. He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage before taking another step in his life. Then he knelt down. Not rushed, not dramatic, but slow, steady, like everything he had done since Marian first met him. The morning light filtered through the window and fell on his hand where a silver ring rested in his palm. The silver light was not dazzling, but soft like the autumn moonlight. Marian felt something sacred, not because of the ring, but because of the way Jonah held it with all his heart. "Marian," his voice was low but warm enough to soothe even the lingering wounds inside her, "I cannot promise you an easy life. The land has never been kind. Winters are always colder than we think. And sometimes the people are too." He paused for a beat, a pause that made the whole room seem still. "But I can promise you that you will never have to face another storm alone again." Marian put her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the breath that was catching in her throat. Not because of surprise, but because beneath the joy was something else, the feeling that her heart had finally found its true home after years of wandering and loss. "Jonah," her voice trembled but not weak, "are you sure I come from somewhere else? I am late. I carry burdens that no one in Red Haven should share." Jonah smiled a smile he rarely showed, a smile that made the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes soften like soil after a rain. "Marian Hale," he said clearly, "none of us stand for you because you are a Hale. We stand for you because you chose to stay. There are many who leave before winter comes. You do not." Marian felt her eyes fill with tears, not tears of pain, but the tears of the last person allowed to believe in tomorrow. She placed her hand over Jonah's heart, a gesture so simple yet so sincere that it could make the other person choke up. "All I ever wanted," she said softly, "was someone to endure the winter with me." Jonah took her hand, squeezing it gently like a promise carved into the earth, into the sky, into the sagebrush valley itself. Mr. Rufus's voice rang out from the door. "Jonah, Marian, the people of Red Haven want to see you." The call gently broke the privacy but did not take away the sacredness of the moment. On the contrary, it made Marian smile, a smile she could not remember the last time she had seen in her life. Jonah stood up still, holding her hand in his as if he didn't want anything more to come between them. "We should go outside," he said. "Perhaps today is the day Red Haven wants to tell you something too." Marian nodded slightly. "And we will go out there together." And when they stepped out onto the porch, the people of Red Haven were waiting, their faces beaming in the morning light. No one spoke, but Marian understood this place had not only opened its arms to her, but it also offered her a place in the valley's long story. A story that would be told many years from now, even after winter had passed and a peaceful life had begun to dawn. Little did the people of Red Haven know that morning, as they stood on the porch of their new home to watch Jonah hold Marian's hand in the early winter sunshine, they were looking at the beginning of a story that would span more than 2 decades. And then the years flowed like the warm wind of Sagebrush Valley, slow, steady, and filled with the little things that held people together. 20 years later, the Red Haven afternoon sun cast a soft golden light over Cedar Hollow, the light that the old folks called the light of days gone by. The once tenanted house was now a spacious one with a wooden porch long enough for the whole family to gather around in the afternoon. The pines still smelled of resin mixed with the smell of dry hay and the laughter of children running around the yard. Marian Hale Reed sat back in a walnut rocking chair, her hands clasped on her knees. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her face had the serene look of someone who had lived through enough storms to know what true peace was. Beside her, Jonah Reed sat silent as usual. But his silence was no longer that of a lonely man, it was the calm of someone who had found a place to return to each day. In the yard, 4 little children ran after each other, their laughter echoing in the wind as if prolonging the youth of the house. The eldest Samuel was trying to ride the weaned lamb, while little Ruth ran after him, laughing and reminding him not to push too hard. Marian looked at them, her eyes so gentle that even the wind seemed to stop. "They are as naughty as their parents were," she said with a smile. Jonah tilted his head slightly at his wife. "I remember. Matt climbed up on the roof of the horse barn one summer just to prove to his friends that he wasn't afraid of heights. I used to worry myself to death," Marian chuckled. "Now they take my breath away every day." Jonah placed his hand on hers, holding it gently, as he had since he knelt in the dawn light that morning. "But they grew up healthy right on the land my parents chose." That was enough. A little further on, right in the middle of the fork leading into the town of Red Haven, stood a small red brick building. The afternoon sun shone on the sign hanging in the yard, Jonah Reed Community School. The school wasn't big, but it was the pride of Sagebrush Valley. It was built with money Marian had saved over the years, along with the efforts of many townspeople, people who had stood by her when her house burned, when the storms came, when Barlow tried to swallow the land. On the day of the inauguration, it was Mrs. Estelle who hung the sign. She said something that Marian still remembers clearly: "Jonah kept justice for the valley. And you, Marian, you keep its future." Now every afternoon from their house on the hill of Cedar Hollow, they could hear the sounds of children studying, practicing songs, running around in the yard. That sound to them was the clearest sign that Cedar Hollow was alive once again. Jonah looked towards the school, his eyes quiet but warm. "You turned loss into something good for the valley," he said, his voice low like the wind through the pines. Marian placed her other hand on Jonah's, her fingers lightly brushing over the calluses that had accompanied him through his life as a ranch hand. "We did it together. Not just you." Jonah nodded slightly. "Yes, but you are the one who brings hope. I am just the one who walks beside you." Marian laughed soft and deep like the sigh of the earth at winter's end. "Jonah Reed, if it weren't for you by my side, I wouldn't have dared to stay here in the first place." The evening wind blew through the porch, carrying with it the smell of hay from Maple Hollow and the sound of horse bells from the main road. The sounds blended together like a familiar melody that had accompanied them for 20 years, the melody of a life that was simple but not insignificant. Jonah leaned his head back against the chair, looking up at the sky. The autumn clouds drifted slowly, light as a memory. "You know," he said, "when I was young, I thought life could only be good if we were far away. But then I met you. And I learned that sometimes peace lies right where you're afraid to face it." Marian squeezed his hand. "And I," she replied, "used to think I was just a misfit. But Red Haven, and you, showed me that everyone has a place they can call home." The children were still running around in the yard. Little Ruth suddenly stopped and turned her head to look up at the porch. "Mrs. Marian, Mr. Jonah." "More stories tonight," Marian laughed. "What is it, daughter, about Luke Hale?" Ruth answered loudly, and then ran off as if afraid she would be caught telling it. Jonah and Marian looked at each other. There was both old sadness and present gratitude in their gazes. The events of their lives had their origins in a man long gone, a man Marian remembered with tenderness. Later, Marian called after him, "I'll tell you about Cedar Hollow, but it's a funny story." The children shouted in unison. The sun was sinking behind Maple Hollow Hill. The last rays of light fell on the porch, casting a golden glow on Marian's silver hair and the shoulders of Jonah's old shirt. Neither of them needed to say anything more. They just sat there watching the sky and earth change color, watching their grandchildren grow up day by day, watching the school at the foot of the hill light up every time the sunlight touched it. A human life eventually becomes part of the valley, a love that eventually becomes the warmth of the whole community. Jonah squeezed his wife's hand again. "Marian," he said slowly and clearly, as if afraid to lose the most beautiful thing in his life, "I think your father would be proud." Marian leaned her head against his shoulder. "I believe so. And I know he would thank you, Jonah Reed." A long, beautiful, full silence. Then Marian said, "We did it. Together." And so in the middle of the once windy and sandy West, a story ended like a beautiful day ending in sunset, gentle, warm, and deep. There was no magic in it, only faith, kindness, and the courage to continue living a decent life, even when life was not easy. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy they left to Red Haven. Amid the story's stormy west, what touches our hearts is not only Marian Hale's escape from danger or Jonah Reed's bravery, but the quiet reminder that no one is born to go through storms alone. In today's world, although the world is different, everyone still finds themselves standing alone at the desolate stop of life, when facing illness, sadness, loss, or unspeakable pressures. Marian's story teaches us that strength lies not in not being afraid, but in standing up even when the fear is still there. And just as Jonah stepped out of the rain to say the words every lonely heart longs to hear, life sometimes sends us kind people not to save us, but to walk with us, to remind us that goodness still exists and we are worthy of love. If there is one thing this story wants to convey, it is, believe in kindness, choose to get up, and believe that there will always be someone willing to hold your hand when you are at your worst. Thank you for listening to this story with all your heart. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring you warm, healing stories.